The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer, the same frequency Margaret had heard in her nightmares for 20 years, a sound like helicopter rotors at 3 in the morning, like danger breathing in the walls. She pushed through the double doors of Sacred Heart's cardiac unit at 11:36 p.m., her badge clipped to the waistband of her scrubs, her movements economical and precise. The night shift stretched before her like a corridor she'd walked 1,000 times before, medication passes, vital signs, the steady percussion of monitors marking out the hours until dawn broke over San Diego. No one noticed her arrival. That was intentional. Margaret had spent 2 decades learning how to be invisible, first in the Coast Guard, where a woman in special operations discovered early that visibility meant scrutiny, and then, after she'd walked away from the uniform and the missions and the faces she couldn't unsee, invisibility became her survival strategy. 23 years of service compacted into a woman who arrived quietly, worked efficiently, and left without drawing attention. The cardiac unit suited her. Most of the day staff saw her as a body moving through space, technically competent but unremarkable, the kind of nurse who didn't create problems and didn't demand recognition. She clocked in. She reviewed the patient census. 2 post-MI recoveries. 1 valve replacement awaiting discharge. 1 new admission with complicated complications, an old wound reopened, her charge nurse had said during report. A Coast Guard officer recovering from injury sustained in theater, whatever that meant in the bureaucratic language of hospital intake forms. The night was quiet. The ICU never slept, but it could be quiet, the machines doing their work, the monitors painting vital signs in liquid crystal, the rhythm of steady-state care humming along without crisis or drama. Margaret moved between rooms with the kind of automaticity that comes from muscle memory, checking lines, adjusting infusions, documenting in the electronic medical record with the same precision she'd once used to map supply routes and casualty counts in a war that officially never happened. At 1:14 a.m., she stood at the medication dispensing station drawing up a 20 mg dose of furosemide for the post-valve patient in room 514. Her hands moved with a kind of tactical precision that would have been unremarkable in a trauma bay but seemed oddly militaristic here in the soft glow of a hospital dispensary at 1 in the morning. She didn't think about this. Her hands knew what to do. They'd held for line steady while helicopters landed under fire. They'd performed emergency needle decompression in the dark. They'd pressed compression bandages against wounds that made grown men weep. A simple push was meditation. That was when Dr. Sterling arrived. He moved through the unit like a man accustomed to the space rearranging itself around him, his white coat pressed sharp as a blade, his stethoscope draped with the kind of casual authority that suggested it was a prop rather than a tool. The cardiac unit director, here for an overnight check on one of his private patients, and he carried with him the weight of 34 years in academic medicine and a reputation built on hierarchies so rigid they showed on X-rays. He passed by the medication station and watched Margaret drawing the syringe, watched her techniques, her posture, the way she approached the locked cabinet with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd secured far more dangerous things than controlled substances. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Not admiration. Recognition, maybe. The kind of recognition a predator has when it identifies another apex creature in its territory. Unusual technique, he said. His voice carried the tone of a man accustomed to being listened to. Most floor nurses use the. This is faster, Margaret said, not turning from her work. 18 gauge, single insert, draws cleaner. She capped the syringe with a movement so smooth it was barely perceptible. Reduces medication waste by approximately 3% annually per nurse. Sterling's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected data. He'd expected deference. Maybe a question about his preferred method. Not a quiet statement of fact followed by a turning away. Well, we follow protocol here, he said, a thin edge entering his voice. This isn't. He paused, searching, then didn't finish. He moved past her toward the patient rooms, but the moment had settled between them like sediment in a test tube. Margaret didn't watch him go. She finished her medication pass, room 514, room 516, room 518, and then pushed through the stairwell door toward the 4th floor, where the new admission was being stabilized. Commander James Reeves. Coast Guard. Theater injuries. 72 hours admitted, her census note said, complications from old shrapnel wounds, cardiac monitoring required. She didn't know why she pulled up his chart before entering the room. Some instinct, some warning from the part of her that had survived 20 years of missions by noticing the small things. Date of birth. Place of residence. A photograph attached to the medical record, Coast Guard uniform, captain's bars, the formal bearing of command. She looked at the photograph for exactly 3 seconds, and the bottom of the world fell away. The eyes were the same. Older now, of course. 20 years older. But the same. She could see the 8-year-old in there, trapped behind officer rank composure and the distant gaze of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. She could see him the way he'd been in the rubble, crying and bleeding, one hand reaching up toward the light, toward the helicopter shadows, toward the promise of rescue. She'd pulled him out that day. She'd pressed his small wrist for a pulse and found one, racing like a bird's heartbeat, and she'd wrapped him in a field blanket and handed him to a flight medic whose name she'd never learned. That had been 20 years ago, in a city that had burned itself into her bones. She stood outside his room for 5 seconds. Then she pressed her badge to the card reader and entered, and when she did, she was invisible again, just a night nurse, just someone doing a job, just a woman in scrubs checking on a cardiac patient with the kind of detached professionalism that suggested she'd never met him before in her life. "Good evening, Commander," she said. Her voice was level. "I'm Margaret. I'll be monitoring you tonight. How are you feeling?" James Reeves looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment something flickered in his expression, the same recognition she'd felt. But he didn't speak. He just nodded, and she turned to his monitor and began the evening assessment with the kind of systematic attention that implied nothing had shifted in the universe, nothing had cracked open, nothing threatened to spill out into the sterile light of a hospital room. She adjusted his full rate. She documented his vital signs. She checked the surgical site on his chest where the old Baghdad shrapnel had shifted, had moved closer to something vital, had decided after 2 decades of stillness to start its damage work again. 440 miles northeast of where she'd pulled him from rubble. Same body. Different decade. Same woman holding the instruments, but changed in ways no uniform could contain. When she finished, she stepped back from the bed and noticed, as she always did, in the privacy of working alone, the weight she carried in her left hand. She wore a wedding ring, or something that resembled one. Not gold. Titanium. Thin and worn, dented in ways that suggested hands that had gripped it through 1,000 nights of insomnia. She touched it briefly, a gesture so small it barely registered as movement, a gesture that said something about the parts of herself she'd buried so deep they might as well have been caked in desert sand. The night continued. The monitors painted their steady graphs. Margaret moved through the unit with her characteristic precision, existing in the spaces between attention, invisible to everyone including herself. But something had shifted. The boy in Baghdad had a face now. The missions had a context. The dust on the boots in her closet had a name. She didn't know it yet, but her disappearance was about to end. She didn't know that Dr. Sterling, walking past her station at 2:13 a.m., had begun the slow work of feeling threatened by her presence. She didn't know that the fluorescent lights would soon witness something that would tear through every hierarchy he'd spent 34 years constructing. But the night hummed on, and Margaret moved through it like a ghost, and somewhere in the basement of Sacred Heart, the morgue was empty, waiting. Morning rounds at Sacred Heart began at 6:56 a.m., and Dr. Sterling moved through the cardiac unit like a man conducting a symphony he'd composed himself. Margaret pushed the medication cart 2 steps behind him, her hand steady, her eyes fixed on the vitals board. Commander James Reeves occupied room 412, and his family had arrived early, his wife Sarah in a pressed blue dress, their 2 children still drowsy in the corner chairs, coloring books unopened on their laps. Sterling paused at the threshold. Margaret saw the calculation happen in his face, the moment he decided that an audience would sharpen his blade. He turned to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Nurse Walsh, perhaps you'd like to explain your outdated protocols to the family. Or does 20 years of, he paused, letting the silence stretch. What was it, temp agency work, qualify you to override cardiology? The children looked up. Sarah's hand found her husband's shoulder. Margaret took one measured breath. She'd been stabbed with words before. In Baghdad, she'd been stabbed with bullets and watched men die who were 19 years old. A physician's contempt registered somewhere between a mosquito bite and background noise. Commander Reeves' heart rate elevated 3 beats per minute over the last 6 hours, she said quietly. His K+ is at 5.8. The protocol you ordered yesterday would have. Would have what? Sterling's voice rose. Been executed by a nurse whose credentials consist of pushing pills for a temp agency? I have a 34-year reputation in this hospital, Nurse Walsh. What do you have? A badge that says Sacred Heart, which you seem to think qualifies you to second-guess board-certified physicians. He turned to Sarah. I apologize. Some staff members struggle with their scope of practice. This won't happen again. Margaret watched the commander's wife look away, embarrassed by the violence of it, not physical, not yet, but violence nonetheless. The children had returned to their coloring books. One of them had begun pressing the crayon too hard into the paper, making marks that were almost tears. Sterling left. Margaret adjusted the foredrip without a word, her movements precise, professional, invisible. The family watched her work. No one thanked her. No one spoke at all. The break room the next morning was full when Margaret pushed through the door. Conversation stopped like a switch flipping. 2 nurses she'd worked with for 4 months suddenly remembered they needed supplies from the medication dispensary. Another checked her watch and announced she had a patient who probably needed her. Within 90 seconds, the room was empty except for the coffee maker hissing and Margaret standing with her sandwich. She ate alone. The sandwich tasted like cardboard and resignation. By 10 a.m., Dr. Sterling had posted the write-up on the unit board where all 47 cardiac unit staff members would see it. Margaret read it during her lunch break, standing in the medication room with the door closed. The document was dated and time-stamped, each word chosen for maximum institutional weight, failure to respect physician authority. Persistent insubordination. Pattern of inappropriate questioning of treatment protocols. His signature was bold, confident, the handwriting of a man who believed institutions existed to validate his importance. At 2:15 p.m., Sterling stopped at the nurse's station while Margaret was documenting Commander Reeves' afternoon vitals. His voice carried across the open floor, intentional, audible to the patients and families passing in the hallway. Temp Walsh, maybe you should stick to bedpans. Leave the thinking to people with actual credentials. He smiled at the cardiac monitor tech as if they were sharing a private joke. Some people know their place. Some people need reminders. Margaret's hands didn't shake as she initialed the write-up that evening. Her signature was steady, precise. A senior chief petty officer learns early that her body is the only weapon she cannot afford to lose to emotion. Control it, master it, and it becomes a tool. Let it betray you, and you die on a Baghdad street with 18-year-olds screaming your name. But in her car that night, parked in the Sacred Heart lot with the engine running and the heater on full blast, something cracked. Her son found her there at 11 p.m., tears streaming down her face in a way he hadn't seen in 5 years, since his father had left and she'd learned to stop showing the damage. She didn't speak. He sat in the passenger seat and didn't speak either. Sometimes the hardest part of loving someone is knowing that their broken places don't belong to you and you can't fix them, and all you can do is sit in the car and pretend the darkness is temporary. At 1:58 a.m. on Tuesday, Margaret checked Commander Reeves' vitals for the 3rd time that shift. His heart rate sat at 92, elevated from his baseline of 68. She made a note in his chart, not an accusation, just data. Observation. The kind of small notation that doctors ignore until it's too late. She'd learned in Baghdad that the people who saved your life were often the ones you ignored until they were standing between you and a blade. The hallway lights flickered at 2:01 a.m. Margaret heard the boots before she saw the man. Wrong rhythm. Wrong weight distribution. The gait of someone who'd never trained to move quietly, who believed that size and aggression were the same as competence. A man in a dark jacket pushed past the nurse's station, and Margaret's nervous system went nuclear in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The bulge under his left arm wasn't a stethoscope. The way his eyes fixed on the room numbers, 412, 413, 414, was the look of someone hunting. He pushed into room 412 without knocking. Margaret moved without deciding to move. Her body remembered every close-quarters combat drill from Joint Base San Antonio, Lackland, every night training in the Desert Combat Readiness Course, every alley in Baghdad where being slow meant being dead. She stepped through the doorway just as the blade came up, a kitchen knife, something stolen from a home or a restaurant, 8 inches of steel catching the hospital light. "All you military bastards," the man was saying, but Margaret's shoulder was already moving, deflecting his arm upward. The blade caught her above the collarbone, a hot line of fire, and she heard fabric tear and then something worse, the sound of her own skin breaking, the wet whisper of a blade finding its purpose. She drove forward, using his own momentum, and his surprise cost him a half-second. The second stab came lower, aiming for her ribs, and she twisted but not fast enough. The blade punched into her left side, below her cardiac margin, and pain became a bright red thing that filled her entire world. Everything narrowed to the knife, the hand holding it, the face of the man who decided tonight was the night he'd take back some imagined honor. "Security," Margaret said, her voice perfectly level, the voice of a senior chief commanding a room full of panicked sailors. "Room for 12. Armed assailant. Now." The man was stronger, but Margaret had fought for survival in places where the rules were written in blood and dust. She used his rage against him, let him press forward, then pivoted and drove him sideways into the cardiac monitor. The machine sparked. An alarm began wailing. She had him in a restraint position, left arm across his throat, right hand locking his wrist, when security burst through the door, weapons drawn, and the man went limp like a puppet with cut strings. Margaret released him and her knees gave out. She was on the floor, blood spreading across her scrubs in a pattern that looked almost artistic, when she registered that Commander Reeves was screaming. Not from the attack. From his chest. His eyes were wide with the specific terror of a military man whose body is failing him, whose old wounds were choosing this moment, this chaos, this violence, to remind him that shrapnel embedded in muscle tissue doesn't stay dormant forever. His heart rate was climbing. 118, 134. 142, his breathing shallow and rapid, his oxygen saturation dropping in real time as his damaged cardiac tissue began to distend, fluid filling the pericardial sac around his heart, pressure building, his heart running out of room to beat. Cardiac tamponade. The exact complication that happened when old injuries and fresh trauma collided. Margaret's vision was swimming, but her hands moved anyway. They'd always moved when lives hung in the balance, moving on their own like a memory her body couldn't forget. "Get me a 18-gauge needle and 10 milligrams of my Dazalam," she said, her voice still steady, still commanding, even as her left side burned and blood pooled beneath her on the floor. "Now." "And someone call the cardiologist." But that wasn't the worst part. At 2:03 a.m., the cardiac monitor's alarm registered as a single sustained note, a sound like nothing else in a hospital, because it meant the patient was already dead and the machine was simply announcing it. Margaret was finishing her rounds, her shoulder throbbing where the first knife had entered, her left side burning where the second blade had carved through muscle and intention when she'd pivoted to shield Commander Reeves' body. The stitches under her scrubs were already starting to pull. Blood had soaked through the gauze on her shoulder. She'd changed her scrubs twice. Nobody had commented. Nobody ever commented when it was just a nurse. The attacker, a disgruntled veteran, the security footage would later confirm, someone with a bad conduct discharge and a list of military hospitals as targets, had come through the service entrance at 2:01 a.m. No alarm. No hesitation. Just a man with a survival knife and 23 years of rage, moving toward the commander's room like he'd trained for it. Which he probably had. Margaret had been standing at the med cart, documenting vitals, when she heard the crash of the door. No screaming. That was the part that stuck with her later. The attacker didn't yell. He just moved, the knife already in his hand, reflecting the hallway fluorescence like a promise. She'd turned toward the sound the way a radar dish turns toward a signal, not because she decided to, but because her spine recognized threat the way most people recognize their own name. Commander Reeves was still asleep. Recovering. Healing. The 8-year-old boy from Baghdad was now 30 years old and lying in a hospital bed in San Diego with a chest tube in his thorax and sutures across his ribs, and Margaret moved between him and the knife with the mechanics of someone whose body had answered this exact question 10,000 times before. Not whether. How. The blade went in at her left shoulder, above the clavicle, angling down toward the brachial plexus with the precision of someone who knew anatomy well enough to kill. Pain is information. She pivoted. Felt the knife exit. Felt air rushing into the wound. Felt something hot and red begin its argument with gravity. The second wound came because she didn't retreat. The attacker had expected retreat. Retreat was the civilian response. Margaret had worn a different uniform for 23 years, and her muscle memory had a longer memory than her conscious mind. She turned into him instead of away, the move called a tight sidestep in combatives training, called suicide in civilian emergency medicine, and his second strike meant to disembowel her caught her in the left flank instead, below the rib cage, deep enough to make her vision pixelate. She didn't fall. Falling was the second mistake civilians made. Her hands were already moving. Training had hollowed out time the way a river hollows stone, and in that hollowed out space she was still a senior chief petty officer at a forward operating base in Helmand province, still 18 years younger, still bleeding out in a supply tent where the electricity was stolen and the antibiotics were expired. The attacker, this one in San Diego at 2:04 a.m., had already committed to his next strike. Muscle memory was faster. She turned his arm. The knife clattered to the tile floor with a sound like a drop tray, 3 distinct impacts, each one sharper than the last. By the time security arrived, 87 seconds later, Margaret had the attacker on his back with his arm in an angle that suggested anatomical mistakes were about to happen. She wasn't holding him down so much as she was containing him, the way a jar contains something that wants to break loose. Security took him. A phone call was made. Someone mentioned police. Margaret watched them move him out of the room and felt something inside her chest switch off, the same switch that had been off for 23 years, the same switch that only flipped back on when the body remembered what it was built to do. She became aware of her shoulder. Then her side. Then the fact that her hands were shaking, which meant adrenaline was finally remembering to show up, which meant shock was making an appointment. "You're bleeding," someone said. One of the security guards. Young guy. Looked like he'd never seen a person bleed before. Margaret turned back to the commander's bed and that's when she saw his face. Jaw clenched. Eyes open. The cardiac monitor showing rhythm, good rhythm, actually, the rhythm of someone still alive, and then she saw his hand move to his sternum. Saw the fingers curl. Saw the color start its retreat from his face like the tide going out, never to come back. "No," she said. "Quiet." Just one word. His monitor climbed. Heart rate, 132. 147, 156. Climbing the scale like a pilot pulling back on the stick too hard. His breathing became short, clipped. Desperate. The oxygen saturation his monitor was reading started with a 9 but his lips started with a blue. Cardiac tamponade. She recognized it the way someone recognizes a face from 20 years ago, the way the body knows things the mind hasn't had permission to say. His old shrapnel wounds. The trauma surgeons in Baghdad had missed something. Or hadn't missed it, had just known it would come back someday the way ghosts always do, and this was someday. This was 2:07 a.m. on a Tuesday in San Diego, and the old wound had come to collect. Fluid. Blood. Pressing against his heart. The one organ that doesn't forgive, that doesn't understand mercy, that only understands pressure and space and the mathematics of insufficient room. Pericardial tamponade. The heart drowning in its own blood while he screamed silently, his mouth open but no sound coming out, the way drowning actually works. The crash cart was being wheeled in. She could hear it in the hallway. 30 seconds. Maybe less. She could also hear the flat mathematics of what 30 seconds meant when someone's heart was being crushed from the inside. She moved. The supplies were where she'd stocked them, because she'd spent 3 weeks on this unit memorizing the location of every syringe, every gauge, every piece of equipment that might matter. A 14-gauge needle. Alcohol swab. She knew the landmarks: second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the place where the anatomical map said the heart lived. She was bleeding through her second pair of scrubs. Her left arm was starting to argue about obedience. She didn't consult either of these facts. The commander's skin was cool. Clammy. The skin of someone whose blood pressure had dropped below the threshold where the body bothers maintaining the pretense of circulation. She swabbed the site. The needle went in. She felt resistance, the pericardial sac, the tight membrane that was crushing him, and then the subtle give that meant she was inside. The syringe filled with blood. Dark, venous. Not oxygenated. Not doing what blood was supposed to do. The commander gasped. Actual sound. Actual breath. The color started coming back to his face like someone was turning up the brightness on a photograph. His oxygen sat 87. 91, 94. The numbers climbing. The rhythm steadying. The desperate screaming in his chest finally having somewhere to go other than inward. Dr. Sterling arrived 20 minutes later, which meant he'd received a call the moment the cardiac monitor alarmed. Which meant he wasn't asleep. Which meant he'd been waiting for something to go wrong. That was his particular gift, not the ability to recognize problems, but the ability to recognize opportunities for problems to become his leverage. He saw the scene. Margaret in fresh scrubs with blood still seeping through the gauze on her shoulder. The commander stabilized, color returned, breathing easy. The needle on the bedside table. The syringe filled with dark blood. Margaret receiving stitches from one of the night nurses, her jaw set, her eye somewhere else. His face went through 3 expressions in sequence: surprise, understanding, calculation. By the time the third one settled, she knew what was coming. "You performed a procedure outside your scope," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact. A statement of guilt already pronounced. You violated every protocol we have. You're a bedside nurse, Ms. Walsh. You don't perform procedures. You don't make clinical decisions. You don't. He was dead, Margaret said. For words. She didn't look at him. Tamponade. Minutes out from cardiac arrest. I called for the crash cart. They weren't here yet. You performed pericardiocentesis without physician authorization. I performed pericardiocentesis because he was dying and I was bleeding, and the alternative was explaining to someone why I let that happen. Her voice hadn't changed pitch. Hadn't changed pace. The voice of someone describing the weather. You have security footage. You have the syringe. You have his stabilized vitals. Dr. Sterling stepped out into the hallway. Margaret heard him before she saw him. "Yes, board president, I know it's 4 a.m. We have a serious security risk on the cardiac unit. A nurse with a completely unexplained work history just performed an authorized surgery and we need to discuss immediate containment." Unauthorized surgery. Not emergency intervention. Not life-saving measure. Surgery. The word choice was careful. The word choice was a knife, and she was very familiar with knives. She finished getting her stitches. 19 total. 8 on the shoulder. 11 on her side. The nurse was someone she recognized but didn't know, the kind of nurse who'd started shunning her 3 days ago when Sterling had started his whisper campaign. The nurse's hands were efficient and kind. She didn't make eye contact. Sterling was still in the hallway, and she could hear him building his case the way some people build walls, one stone at a time, each one carefully selected for fit. He called his contacts at the temp agency that had placed her 3 months ago. He called the hospital administrator at home. He requested an outside investigator, someone from the state medical board, someone impartial, someone who could review every chart she'd touched, every vital she'd documented, every order she'd questioned. By 6 a.m., she'd been asked to surrender her badge. By 6:02 a.m., she'd been formally terminated for performing procedures outside her scope of practice and safety concerns related to her undocumented work history. By 7:15 a.m., she was standing at the bus stop in the rain with a cardboard box containing a cracked mug, a dying plant from her apartment, a photograph of her Coast Guard unit with half the faces now dead in some country she still couldn't talk about, and a pair of worn combat boots caked with Baghdad dust that she'd never cleaned off because cleaning them felt like surrender. The rain hammered down like judgment. Like artillery. Like something that knew exactly where you stood and had decided to stay. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that she'd made the right decision twice, once 20 years ago in Baghdad when she'd pulled an 8-year-old boy from rubble, and once at 2:07 a.m. in San Diego when she'd put a needle between his ribs to keep him alive. The worst part was knowing she'd do it again. The fluid was crushing his heart. Margaret saw it on the monitor before she heard the alarm, the pressure climbing, the electrical activity of the heart growing frantic and useless, like a fist squeezing inside his chest. Commander Reeves' oxygen saturation tanked from 94 to 78 in the span of 6 heartbeats. His blood pressure collapsed to 62/40. The monitors screamed their electronic warnings into the chaos of the trauma bay, but Margaret was already moving, her hand steady despite the blood still seeping through her shoulder dressing, despite the stitches pulling tight across her ribs with every breath. Cardiac tamponade. The shrapnel from Baghdad had waited 2 decades to finish what it started. The trauma from the stabbing, the violent movement, the adrenaline spike, had torn open the scarring around his heart. Now blood pooled in the pericardial sac, the fibrous membrane surrounding his heart, and with each compression it tightened like a fist. Minutes. He had minutes before his pressure crashed to nothing, before his heart could no longer pump against the weight of its own blood. "I need an 18-gauge needle, a 3-way stopcock, and a syringe," Margaret said. Her voice was different now, not the deferential murmur of the invisible nurse, but the clipped precision of someone accustomed to giving orders in rooms where people died if you hesitated. "And call for an echo probe. I need real-time guidance." The residents froze. One of them looked toward the door as if Dr. Sterling might materialize and save them from this moment of uncertainty. Margaret didn't wait for permission she didn't need. She moved to the bedside, her movements economical and clean, every motion a memory embedded in muscle, the kind of knowledge that doesn't fade even when you spend 2 decades trying to forget it. Pain was information. Pain told you which ribs had been broken. Pain told you which movements still worked despite the damage. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, angling slightly toward the patient's left shoulder. The textbooks called it a specific angle, a path through skin and muscle and fascia to the space between the heart and its containing sac. Margaret didn't need the textbooks. Her hands moved on their own, the needle sliding home with a distinctive soft resistance of entry, and then, the hiss of air and fluid escaping, the immediate shift in the monitor as pressure inside the chest dropped, as the heart suddenly had room to beat again. Blood began flowing back into the syringe. Dark, deoxygenated blood from around the heart. Each milliliter she withdrew was breathing room, was life spilling backward into plastic, was time purchased at the cost of careful hands and muscle memory she'd never wanted to use again. O2 sac climbed. 80. 85. 91. The blood pressure ticked upward, 70/45, then 82/52, then stabilizing around 95/60. The cardiac monitor shifted from the chaotic dysrhythmia of a heart being strangled to the organized electrical rhythm of a heart that could beat. Sinus rhythm. Normal sinus rhythm. The sound like a metronome finding its pace again, like a soldier remembering how to breathe. Commander Reeves gasped, a real breath, a desperate inhalation of oxygen finally reaching his lungs, his body finally remembering how to live. His wife sobbed from the corner of the trauma bay, her hand covering her mouth. The resident stared at the monitor as if it might explain what they just witnessed. Margaret withdrew the needle, pressed gauze to the puncture site, and was already reaching for the dressing supplies when the trauma bay doors swung open. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway, his expression cycling from shock to calculation to something that looked like controlled fury. His eyes moved from Commander Reeves, gasping, alive, monitors showing stable vital signs, to Margaret, standing with blood on her scrubs and her own puncture wound still seeping through hastily applied bandages. His gaze locked on the used syringe, the fluid they'd withdrawn from around the commander's heart, the evidence of a procedure performed outside her scope. "What exactly did you just do?" His voice was soft, which was worse than if he'd shouted. Soft voices were more dangerous. Margaret turned to face him, her hand still resting on the bandage site. She didn't answer. There was no answer he would accept. There was only the patient breathing on his own, only the monitor showing steady vital signs, only the undeniable fact that he was alive because she'd acted and would be dead if she'd waited for proper hierarchy to navigate the chains of command. "You performed a pericardiocentesis," Sterling continued, stepping into the room. His voice carried the tone of someone reading evidence at a trial. "Without physician authorization. Without even a nurse practitioner standing over you. You violated every protocol we have." He turned to one of the residents, his expression sharpening into something predatory. "Get me documentation. Every step. Every fluid withdrawal. Every moment she was working outside her scope." Then back to Margaret, "You need to report to administration. Now. Someone will escort you." The next 18 hours moved with the precision of a predetermined collapse. Security appeared before Margaret had even finished her shift, before the adrenaline had fully drained from her system. She was sent home to shower the blood from her hair, to change out of scrubs stained with crimson and iodine, to sit in the sterile silence of her apartment while her shoulder throbbed and her ribs screamed every time she moved. By dawn, Sterling had submitted a formal complaint. By 7 a.m., it had been escalated to the hospital administrator. By 10 a.m., Margaret stood in a corner office on the administrative floor, her arm immobilized in a sling, stitches pulling tight across her side with every breath. The folder on the desk in front of the hospital administrator was thick, papers Sterling had clearly compiled with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this moment since the day Margaret questioned his treatment plan. "Ms. Walsh," the administrator began, not meeting her eyes. He was a man who'd built his career on avoiding conflict, on letting people like Sterling do the heavy lifting of institutional violence. "Dr. Sterling has documented a series of concerning patterns. The unauthorized procedure is the most serious, but there are other issues. Your employment history is vague. How you came to work here through a temp agency. No references from your previous positions." Margaret didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The references existed but existed under different names, names that belonged to people she'd been in lives she'd tried to leave behind. Speaking them aloud would be opening doors she'd sealed. "Dr. Sterling is concerned about your credibility," the administrator continued. "About whether we truly know who we employed. The procedure you performed, saving the patient's life or not, it was outside your scope. It violates hospital policy. And given these other concerns, I think it's best if we proceed with termination." "He would have died," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it had changed. The composure wasn't fragile anymore. It was the composure of someone who'd already accepted the worst. Without the pericardiocentesis, Commander Reeves would have been in complete cardiac arrest within 3 minutes. There was no time to wait for authorization. There was only time to act. "Yes, well." The administrator's fingers drummed the desk once, twice. "You saved a life. We all appreciate that. But you're not a physician. You're not even a nurse practitioner. The hospital has protocols for a reason. And frankly, given your background concerns, this seems like the safest course." Sterling stood in the corner of the office, a silent witness to his own victory. His expression was composed, professional, the picture of reasonable institutional concern. He'd been smart about it. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or make threats. He'd simply documented, compiled, and let the machinery of bureaucracy do what it did best, protect itself and punish those who stepped outside the prescribed boundaries. The security escort came an hour later. Margaret packed her belongings into a cardboard box that the guard probably used for everyone: terminations, resignations, the small humiliations of people leaving under difficult circumstances. She took the cracked coffee mug from the break room, the one with the faded Coast Guard logo from a unit gathering in 2004. She took the dying succulent plant from her locker, the one her son had given her 3 years ago when she'd first checked herself out of the VA medical center and decided to disappear into the anonymity of healthcare work. And she took the photograph, the one photo she'd kept of her Coast Guard unit, taken in Bahrain in 2003 before the second deployment, before the third one, before the faces in the back row started getting replaced by younger faces who hadn't yet learned what they were being asked to carry. The rain started just after noon. Margaret stood at the bus stop near Sacred Heart, the cardboard box growing soggy in her lap, watching the photo beneath the topmost layer begin to absorb water. She could fix that. She could pull it out, dry it carefully, preserve it, but she didn't move. Her shoulder ached with a deep, bone-level pain. Her ribs throbbed in a syncopated rhythm with her heartbeat. And underneath all of that, there was the exhaustion that came from maintaining a mask for so long that you started to believe it was your actual face. 23 years. That's what she'd given to the Coast Guard. 23 years of search and rescue operations, of interdictions, of things she couldn't talk about and probably should have told a therapist if she'd been capable of admitting to a therapist that she'd ever needed one. She'd walked away to heal. She'd changed her name in the databases, changed nothing legally but changed enough so that no one from that life could find her unless they were looking very specifically. She'd taken a job as a nurse because healing was the only language she still spoke fluently, and because quiet competence had always been her default state. And now the hospital had decided that competence was a threat. The bus pulled up 17 minutes late, its doors hissing open with the sound of compressed air escaping. Margaret gathered the box, stood on legs that felt heavier than they should, and climbed aboard. She chose a seat in the back, away from the few other passengers, and watched San Diego slide past the window, the familiar streets, the neighborhood she'd carefully made herself invisible in, the city that had seemed like it might become something resembling a home. The rain hammered against the bus windows like applause for a performance no one had asked for. The hospital board reconvened at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, Dr. Sterling's PowerPoint slides glowing on the screen behind him, his laser pointer ticking like a metronome as he presented his security risk assessment to the assembled administrators. He was 3 slides into his narrative: Margaret Walsh as liability, as rogue operator, as threat to institutional protocol, when the conference room doors burst open with the force of something vindicated. Margaret's son, 17 years old and trembling with the kind of controlled fury that runs in families, strode directly to the center table. His arms held a cardboard box overflowing with framed photographs and medals, each one catching the fluorescent light like an accusation. He didn't ask permission. He didn't knock twice. "My mom," he said, his voice cracking once before steadying, is Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. The room fractured into silence. Sterling's laser pointer fell away from the slide. His mouth opened. Closed. Margaret stood in the doorway. She'd been called back to collect her final paycheck, her severance papers already signed with the kind of pen they use in offices where people decide other people's fates. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She watched her son open that box like he was opening the door to a room they'd both pretended didn't exist for 20 years. A board member, the hospital president, actually, whose golf partner was Dr. Sterling, leaned forward and pulled a framed photograph from the stack. His eyes moved across the text beneath it. Then he picked up another. Then another. 3 purple hearts, he read aloud, and his voice had the particular quality of someone watching their own assumptions collapse in real time. Silver star. Bronze star. 2 bronze stars. Each medal announced like a verdict. 23 commendations for valor. 23. The numbers hung there. Dr. Sterling's face drained the way faces do when someone finally sees you clearly and doesn't like what they're looking at. The conference room doors opened again. Commander James Reeves appeared in his hospital gown, leaning on an four-pole with the careful precision of someone whose lungs still remembered Baghdad dust and whose body remembered being 8 years old and convinced he was going to die in the rubble. He looked at Margaret across the room. His eyes didn't waver. "I'm Coast Guard intelligence," he said, his voice the steady tenor of someone trained to deliver difficult truths to powerful people. "Senior Chief Walsh saved my life 20 years ago in Fallujah, Jolan district. I was a child. She pulled me from a collapsed building." He paused. His grip on the four-pole tightened. "2 nights ago, she saved my life again. The man who broke into my room wasn't a disgruntled veteran. He was a foreign operative targeting military personnel in American medical facilities. Margaret identified him. She neutralized the threat. She did what she was trained to do." Sterling stood up. His chair scraped backward, the sound of it like something breaking. The board president's hand went up, not dismissive, authoritative. "Sit back down." The FBI liaison entered next. Entered, not walked. The kind of entrance that changes air pressure in a room. He opened a folder. His voice was flat, bureaucratic, the way federal agents speak when they're confirming that everything you believed about yourself was smaller than the actual truth. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Walsh has been providing informal threat assessments on foreign agents targeting military medical facilities across Southern California," he said. "She was cleared for this work. She was vetted for this work. Your hospital fired a person operating under federal clearance while actively protecting American lives." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the board chair stood, a woman Margaret had never spoken to, whose name was Barbara Liu and whose daughter was a nurse at Scripps, and whose face now showed the particular expression of someone who understood they'd just been on the wrong side of history. "Dr. Sterling," Barbara Liu said, and the words came out the way they do when a door closes and locks behind it, "your resignation is effective immediately." Sterling's face went gray. Not red. Not angry. Gray, the way faces go when someone finally understands they've spent 20 years building a house of cards on someone else's foundation. His hands moved toward the table in front of him, but there was nothing to hold. His mouth moved. No sound came out. Margaret still hadn't moved from the doorway. The next 6 months unfolded in the way consequences do when they're finally allowed to move. Sterling's network, it turned out, was mostly constructed from fear. When the FBI confirmed Margaret's clearance, when the story leaked to local news, "Decorated war hero fired after saving lives," the headline read, "His face in a side-by-side comparison with her medals, his golf partner wouldn't return his calls. His supervisor requested his resignation." 3 other nurses came forward about the cases he'd buried, about the recommendations he'd ignored that led to patient complications. His wife asked why reporters were calling the house. His hands shook as he cleaned out his office alone, watching the same nurses who'd avoided Margaret now watch him pack in a silence that felt like judgment. Margaret, meanwhile, accepted an offer that came hand-delivered by the hospital board president herself, director of the new military civilian emergency response program at Sacred Heart. The title meant something. The salary meant something. But what meant everything was the office where she set up her workspace, its windows facing east, its shelves already waiting. She placed the combat boots there on the first morning, the ones with Baghdad dust still caked into the treads, the dust she'd finally decided didn't need to be cleaned off, didn't need to be hidden, didn't need to be ashamed of. The morning light hit them directly. They looked like what they were, proof of survival. 6 months after Sterling's firing, Margaret stood in that same training center, briefing a class of new nurses on tactical emergency response, how to recognize security threats, how to protect patients without waiting for permission, how to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. The same security guard who'd handed her that cardboard box in the rain was working at Sacred Heart now, officially. He'd quit the community college position 3 months in. Said he couldn't handle the location anymore. Because that's where Dr. Sterling ended up, teaching CPR courses at a community college in El Cajon, minimum wage, no title, no board connections, no network. He packed his teaching materials with hands that trembled, CPR dummies, basic first aid posters, a name tag that read instructor instead of a doctor. The security guard appeared at his classroom door on his last day, holding out a cardboard box. "I believe you know the way out, sir," the guard said. The same words. Different context. Margaret never went to watch. Never stood in the parking lot or in the back of the classroom. She had no need to. She touched the combat boots each morning instead, remembering who she'd been, who she'd become, and understanding finally that these things had never been separate. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had served in silence for 20 years, hidden in anonymity for 2 more, and now she served in the open, rank on her resume, boots on the shelf, a son who didn't flinch when he said his mother's name, a commander who brought his kids to meet the lady who saved Daddy twice. The nightmares came less frequently now. Some nights they didn't come at all. Some mornings she reached for the boots just to touch them in sunlight, just to feel the proof that what had been broken could be honored instead. The training program expanded. 3 other hospitals asked her to consult on their emergency response protocols. The Coast Guard called with a partnership proposal. The Pentagon, eventually, sent a letter, nothing classified, nothing dramatic, just an acknowledgement that her service had been seen and that her service mattered. And on ordinary Tuesday afternoons, between briefings and phone calls and the quiet work of building something from the rubble of what had tried to destroy her, Margaret Walsh would stand in her office, boots gleaming in the light from the window, and remember a terrified 8-year-old boy in Fallujah and a commander in a hospital gown and a son with his mother's composure and a silence that had finally been broken. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. Some wear combat boots, caked with the dust of deserts they survived, displayed in office windows where the light hits them just right and everyone can finally see what was always there. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please hit that subscribe button. Like this video. And comment below, what would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have spoken up, or would you have let the truth speak for itself? The answers matter more than you know. Thank you for listening.